Hi there. Thanks for tuning in to Caritas Querens. This series we're looking at some of the commonly asked questions about Christian universalism. And sorry for the different perspective here, but my phone was about to die, so I had to bring out my cord to plug it in. I had to stay close to the house here, and that's why you see a different perspective in the background and everything. So anyway, it's going to be looking, probably I'll be looking a little bit stranger probably too, because in this one we're going to take a look at a biblical question. So I'm going to have one of my Bibles right here, and I'm going to be looking down at that quite a bit. So you'll probably be looking at my forehead more often than not in this video. So in this series about commonly asked questions about apokatastasis, I'm going to take a look at a couple biblical interpretation questions as well. Now, I'm not a biblical scholar. I do love the Bible. I've studied quite a bit about the Bible. I love to read the Bible. And I have, I would say, a passing knowledge of Greek, a smidge of Hebrew, some things like that, just enough to make me dangerous, like a little learning is a dangerous thing. But I do encourage you, this is not meant to be, an academic lecture or anything like that. So I do encourage you, if you're interested in this, to do your own research, look things up for yourself, find it out. This is not meant to be the be-all and the end-all or to have the final answer about these questions, but really, more than anything, to spur people on to spur you on to look it up more for yourself, to get into the inquiry, to join the search and try to understand and love the truth more, and dig deeper, I guess I would say. So in this video, we're going to look at, this is probably one of the most commonly brought out biblical passages against universalism, and that is Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 through 45. So that's the end of Matthew 25. I'm going to be using the Revised Standard Version Catholic Edition here. It's not my absolute favorite translation, but I think it's pretty good, and it is a very common translation, I think, amongst American Catholics, especially among a lot of serious American Catholics, like conservative Catholics and so on. So that's part of the reason why I'm using this. But feel free to use your own. I'd encourage you to get out a Bible, follow along, or pull something up on your computer or something, an app or something, and follow along in whatever translation you prefer. Maybe your translation will have some other insights, and if it does, post it in the comments below. Let me know, how your translation phrases things, and maybe how that gives you some insights into this. So I'm not actually going to go through and read the whole passage right now. It's kind of a lengthy one, but it's one that I think most Christians and most Catholics know. The story about the separation of the sheep and the goats. Okay, but you know what? Actually, I am going to read it. Forget that. I'm going to read it. I think it's worth actually reading it and just going through this. So if you don't want to hear me read it, just skip the next, minute or so, I guess. And but here's how it goes. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate them one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep at his right hand, but the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, O blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see thee hungry and feed thee, or thirsty and give thee drink? And when did we see thee a stranger and welcome thee, or naked and clothe thee? And when did we see thee sick or in prison and visit thee?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brethren, you did it to me." Then he will say to those at his left hand, "Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they also will answer, "Lord, when did we see thee hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not minister to thee?" Then he will answer them, "Truly I say to you, as you did it not to one of the least of these, you did it not to me." And they will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. Of course, that's Jesus speaking. Okay, and actually it finishes his, I think it's usually called the Olivet Discourse, because right after that, in chapter 26, he tells the disciples again that he's going to be betrayed and put to death, and we see the chief priests and the elders plotting his death and so on, and it kind of, from here on out, it's, the beginning of the paschal mystery of the suffering and death of Christ, and ultimately his resurrection. So now this passage, a lot of people will bring out, especially the end there, They will go away, in other words, the goats, into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. And they'll say, see, it's clear. It's clear in the Bible. Jesus teaches eternal punishment for the goats. That is, even though he doesn't say hell here or Gehenna here, it's implied. He's stating the reality. The name doesn't have to be there at that moment. So it's clear. Eternal punishment. Bam. Universalism shot out of the water, right? Okay. Well, okay. I'm going to look at this from a couple perspectives. First of all, I'm not going to go into a lot of depth here because, like I said, I'm not a biblical scholar. I don't have a really thorough knowledge of New Testament Greek, for instance. But I've read quite a bit about this, and I have enough knowledge of Greek that I think I can follow some scholarly discussions of this and explanations of this passage. But I would encourage you to look into this more yourself. First of all, when we look at this passage biblically in the original Greek, I don't know. There's a couple things that I see here that kind of stand out as some red flags that say to me, maybe this is not meant to be interpreted the way that people often interpret it. Okay? For instance, right in the beginning, this is verse 32, Jesus says, before him will be gathered, before the Son of Man, will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate them one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. Now, I think that's kind of interesting, and I wonder there if what Jesus is implying here is that this is not a judgment of individuals, but a judgment of nations, a judgment of groups of people. And when it talks then about eternal punishment, what might be meant there is not hell for individual sinners, but rather that a nation will be eternally punished. In other words, a nation will basically be destroyed, will be gone, will be heard of no more, okay? Kind of like when Jesus says about, he's talking about some of the cities, that he preached in, like woe to you, Capernaum, and so on. And he talks about them, like, I think he says going down to hell or going down to Hades, and the idea is not that, like, Capernaum, the city, is going to be suffering forever in hell, but it's basically, it's gone, it's done, it's demolished, it's destroyed, it is no more, Okay, so that's the first red flag. I don't know, is he talking here about, specific judgments of individual sinners? But then as we go down here to the end, when Jesus says, they will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal fire, there's a couple other red flags here that I think really bear at least that we kind of stop and think about these things and research them more and ponder them more deeply. First is the Greek word for punishment here. And the Greek word is kolasis, which apparently, again, from what I've read from some scholars and some lexical works, it means something. You can translate it punishment, but it means something more like chastisement or correction. So if it is punishment, it's not a strictly penal, retributive punishment. It is punishment that is meant to correct or ameliorate the situation and ameliorate the person himself, even the perpetrator. It was, I forget where I saw this, but there was one book I read, I think it was William Barclay maybe, who says that one of the earliest references we have to this is Aristotle maybe, who says that the word kolasis is actually a word used for pruning plants. So when you prune a plant, like a rose bush, you're not punishing it just for the sake of punishing it. That's ridiculous. You're basically cutting off some parts of it so that it will grow better. So it's a form of chastisement. So that sends up a red flag here. Where are the goats actually going? Even if these are individuals and their judgment, are they going somewhere to be corrected? Are they going somewhere for their own good in the long run? And the third red flag is the word eternal. So the Greek word here is aionios, and it's an adjective, so the ending changes in Greek. But as many have pointed out, the word aionios does not just obviously, from any etymological perspective or from context or anything, does not obviously just mean eternal in our sense of unending or endless. And there does seem to be some mystery as to where the term aionios comes from. It comes from the Greek word aion, excuse me, aeon. But like, what is the derivation of that? I've read probably 3 or 4 different speculations on where it actually comes from. Um, but what's interesting is when we look at the context, when we look at how the word was used in ancient Greek, it's interesting that it seems to have a basic meaning of like an age. So it can be used, for instance, of a person's lifetime, like your age. It can be used of like we talk sometimes about like an age, like in history, like, the age of reason or something. They call it sometimes the age of humanism or whatever, so like a period of time. So the basic idea seems to be that an aeon in Greek is a time period of unspecified duration. In other words, it's not like a century is always 100 years, a decade is always 10 years. It might be 10, it might be 100, it might be 1,000, it might be just 5 days, but there's no specific duration, but it definitely has a duration. In other words, it has a beginning, it has an end, okay? Which is like the complete opposite of eternity. Eternity, by definition, practically means no beginning and no end. So again, red flag there. Could this potentially mean endless? Yeah, I think it could. And that's an argument that I think it was St. Basil actually uses here, where he says, well, we know that eternal life, the parallel phrase here, so it's the same word aionios, but it's used with the Greek word for life, zoe. He says we know that it is endless. So the word aionios used with life means endless. Therefore, since it's parallel, when he says the others will go to eternal punishment, it must mean also endless punishment here. Okay, but I don't think that that's logical, because a word, and especially an adjective, can have different nuances, I guess you can say, or different substantive meaning, depending on what it's modifying. So, for instance, tall can mean one thing in a sense when you're talking about a tall chihuahua, and when you're talking about a tall building, the basic meaning doesn't change. Tall still means tall, but relatively speaking, it's very different. A tall chihuahua would be a very tiny building. A tall building would be a monstrous and abnormally large chihuahua, So tall doesn't, tall when it's modifying a chihuahua doesn't mean the same thing as tall when it's modifying a building exactly, So aionios, or eternal here, it might imply endlessness when it comes to life. That doesn't mean that it implies endlessness when it is referring to punishment. So let me give you an example of what I mean here in this particular context. Let's say that aionios refers to the word aeon, to you could say an age, okay? So we could say it's age-long life, okay? And age-long punishment that lasts as long as the age, life that lasts as long as the age. Now, if the age referred to here is some coming age, the age after the Son of Man comes in his glory and judges the sheep and the goats, separates the sheep and the goats, right? Well, then it makes sense that the life is endless, because that is the age to come, the age when we are united with God fully in heaven, you would say. And so it is the life of the age, and that age just happens to be an endless one. Therefore, the life is also endless, because the age is endless, right? But what if the punishment that God has set is not endless, is temporary, is actually finite in duration? Okay, then the punishment would still be aeonios, it would still be age-long, it would still last as long as the age, but maybe God has only set, maybe for one person, it's only 50 years, for another person, it's 5,000 years, whatever. It is still age-long, but that age doesn't have to be endless. The age, in other words, the age of the life might be endless, but the age that God has set for the punishment doesn't have to be endless. Or we could say the sentence. The sentence of the punishment might be finite. The sentence of the life might be unbounded or endless or infinite. Okay? So that's just an example of how the word aeonios doesn't necessarily have to mean endless in both describing the life and the punishment. Okay? But let's say, let me grant infernalists their perspective here and say, okay, fine. I'm going to say this does apply to God judging individual people, individual sinners, and he is talking about endless punishment, endless hell, okay? Can we still see this from a universalist perspective? Can we still reconcile this with apokatastasis? And I'm going to say yes. And I'm going to say, first of all, we need to see this passage in the context. I mean, if you go back and read over some of the previous chapters here, we have some other famous stories about, like the story of the 10 virgins who are waiting for the wedding feast, right? We got the servant who's waiting for his master. We got the master giving the talents to his servants, and what happens when he comes back. And in all of these, one of the common denominators is Jesus is telling people, you don't know when the master's coming back, okay? So be ready. And how are you ready? How can you be ready? Well, you use what you have in a prudent and wise way, okay? In other words, you've received something. You've received talents. You've received, I'm going to look at this from the spiritual perspective. You've received God's life. Now, live it. Live it. Use it properly. And for me, what that implies is here that this separation of the sheep and goats is not talking specifically, is not distinguishing between people who are saved and not saved, or people who have grace and don't have grace, between people who have Christ living in them and people who are living in sin. Okay, I don't think that's the distinction here, because even in this parable of the sheep and the goats, notice that first of all, goats are not unclean animals. This isn't the parable of like the sheep and the pigs. Okay, it's the sheep and the goats. Sheep and goats were basically interchangeable when it came to sacrifices. Okay, so in other words, I think Jesus is almost implying here that there's not a lot of difference between the sheep and the goats. They're almost the same. The difference is not necessarily in what they are, but in how they live. Okay, so I'm going to say that this is more about a parable about how those who have grace, those who have God's life, how they live their life. Okay, and what Jesus is saying is, if you have God's life in you, if you have grace, if Christ is being formed in you, okay, and living in you, then don't wait. Live that life now. Use that life now. Okay, don't be like the foolish virgins who basically just kind of let it go and squander it. Don't be like the foolish servant who basically just goes and buries it. But be ready. Be ready. And use what you have now. And notice how he separates the sheep and the goats. It's based on what they do. It's based on how they live their life. And above all, it's based on charity. It's based on how they love their neighbor. And how do they love their neighbor? It's based on whether they love their neighbor for Christ's sake, or more specifically, it's based on whether they love Christ in their neighbor. I mean, that's a Christian thing. If you're not a believer, if you don't have grace, I would argue you can't love Christ in your neighbor because you don't have his life and his love in you. So this is really, in my opinion, about Christ telling us, if you have my life in you, then use my love. Use my life to love me in others. Okay, and if you don't, okay, then you're a goat, and I'm going to separate you, and you're going to go to eternal punishment. But again, maybe this punishment, even if it's endless hell, maybe that doesn't presuppose that it's endless for you. Okay, maybe there'll be another time when the Son of Man comes to the goats and says, blessed are you. You are no longer sheep. Now you are no longer goats. Now you have become sheep, because of the kolasis aeonia, or aeonios, the eternal punishment. Which is a chastisement, is a correction. You've been corrected. You've become sheep. You've learned how to love me and your neighbor. You've done good deeds. You've become perfected. And so now you can come to the kingdom prepared for you. So I want to suggest that as a possible interpretation here. And honestly, I think it's a beautiful interpretation. I think that, I think one might say, well, then what's the point? If the goats are going to become sheep anyway, what's the point? Why is Jesus warning them and everything? I'll tell you why. Because first of all, it is so much better to be a sheep. And I think, tell me, put it in the comment box below if you want, if you can relate to this, isn't it? From my experience, I can say it is so much better to be a sheep. It's so much happier. There's so much more peace and joy in loving others, in loving Christ in others, in living the life of Christ in my life. I mean, do you agree? If so, put it in the comment box. If you disagree, put that too, and we'll talk about it. But I think that's what Jesus is really encouraging here is, use the gifts I've given you. Use the gift of grace of my life. Develop it. Allow Christ to live his life in you. Allow Christ to love others. To love Christ in others. You'll be happier, being a sheep. But also it's better for others. Those people that you love, guess what? They're going to want to love Christ in return as well. And they're going to become, maybe now they're pigs, and then they'll become sheep, and they'll be happier as sheep. So that's my take on this. So yeah, maybe the punishment is eternal. Okay, I'll grant that to infernalists. That doesn't mean that it doesn't end. That maybe the punishment is eternal. That doesn't mean the sentence is eternal. That doesn't mean that a person might not become corrected to the point where the punishment no longer applies to them. Or you might even say where the punishment is no longer a punishment to them. If you have metal, I guess, like metal ore in a fire, and you're purifying it, you're getting rid of the dross. Once the dross is gone, the fire is no longer a purification, right? That doesn't mean the fire goes out. That doesn't mean the fire, is no more. The fire ceases to exist. The fire might go on and on and on to purify others, but it's no longer a purifying fire for the metal that's been purified, right? So maybe the eternal punishment is eternal in the sense that it's endless, but maybe for those who go there, maybe it ceases to be a punishment at some point. Maybe it ceases to be a correction once they've become corrected. So anyway, that's my take on Matthew 25, verses 31 to 45. Again, if you're enjoying this, please like and subscribe, share this with others. And if you have any comments, please leave them in the comment box below. If you disagree with me, you got your own ideas. And what questions do you have about universal salvation that I can address in this series? Till next time, adios.